No cameras were present, no public vote was taken, and yet one quiet decision made behind closed doors reshaped the future of America forever. It didn't happen in front of cheering crowds or beneath flashing headlines. There was no dramatic announcement, no warning to the people whose lives would soon be altered by it. Instead, it unfolded in silence, inside a room where power spoke softly and consequences waited patiently. Most Americans never knew it happened. Many still don't. But nearly everything about modern America, its economy, its global influence, even the way power operates today, can be traced back to this single moment, a moment when a few individuals chose a path that could never be undone. To understand this decision, we have to go back to a time when America was standing at a crossroads, facing pressures it had never experienced before. The nation was growing fast, industrially, militarily, and economically. Its influence was expanding beyond its borders, and with that influence came fear. Fear of losing control, fear of instability, fear that the systems holding the country together were more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Behind the optimism of progress, there were cracks forming. Government officials knew something the public didn't. They could see the warning signs, numbers that didn't add up, systems that couldn't hold forever, risks that were being quietly ignored. The problem wasn't that America lacked power. It was that too much of it rested on assumptions no one had ever truly tested. Inside the halls of power, conversations began to change. They became more urgent, more secretive. Meetings were held without records. Documents were marked, then locked away, and a question started to dominate every discussion. What happens if we do nothing? The answer frightened them. Doing nothing meant risking collapse, slow at first, then sudden. It meant trusting that the future would behave like the past, even when all signs suggested it wouldn't. And so, a small group was given extraordinary authority to consider an option that would never be presented to the public. An option that, if discovered, could spark outrage. An option that could redefine the balance of power. An option that would quietly change the rules of the game. The decision wasn't made in a single day. It was debated, reshaped, and challenged. Some warned it would go too far. Others argued it didn't go far enough. But everyone in that room understood one thing clearly. Once this decision was executed, there would be no way back. America would become something different. At the heart of the debate was control, not control over people, but control over uncertainty. The fear that unseen forces, economic shifts, global reactions, internal weaknesses could spiral beyond reach. The solution they considered promised stability. On paper, it looked clean, efficient, even necessary. But paper doesn't show consequences. It doesn't show faces. It doesn't show generations shaped by a choice they never consented to. As the final version of the plan took shape, it was stripped of emotional language. It became technical, clinical, almost boring. That was intentional. Decisions that sound ordinary attract less attention, and attention was the one thing they could not afford. When the final moment arrived, it didn't feel historic. There was no applause, no sense of triumph, just signatures, nods, and the quiet understanding that history had just shifted without asking permission. The decision was implemented carefully, almost invisibly. To the average American, nothing seemed different. Life went on, markets opened, laws remained the same, the illusion of normalcy held. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Systems adjusted, power moved, consequences began to ripple outward, slow enough to avoid panic, strong enough to be permanent. The country was now operating under a new reality, one designed by a few, lived by millions. Years later, Analysts would debate when America truly transformed. Some would point to wars, others to elections, a few to cultural revolutions. Almost none would point to this moment, because it was never meant to be seen. Yet its effects were everywhere, in moments of crisis, in sudden shifts of policy, in decisions that seemed to appear from nowhere, already finalized before the public even knows a debate existed. This wasn't just a choice about the present, it was a decision about the future, about who would hold power when uncertainty returned, and how much freedom could be sacrificed in the name of stability. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: the people who made the decision believed they were doing the right thing. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as guardians, protecting a nation from threats it couldn't see. But history has a way of revealing what intentions try to hide, because every secret decision creates a shadow, and shadows don't disappear. They grow. In the next part of this story, we'll step inside that room, examining exactly the pressures that forced this decision, the voices that opposed it, and the warning signs that were ignored. And we'll begin to see how a single quiet choice became one of the most powerful turning points in American history. The pressure that led to the decision didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading beneath a foundation no one thought to inspect. On the surface, America appeared strong. Its economy was expanding, its influence growing, its confidence unmatched. But behind closed doors, the data told a different story. Reports circulated that never reached the public. Forecasts were shared only among a select few. The numbers suggested volatility, systems stretched thin, dependencies piling up, risks multiplying in ways that couldn't be explained away by optimism. Some officials dismissed the concerns as temporary turbulence. Others weren't so sure. They saw patterns repeating, moments in history when powerful nations assumed stability was permanent, right up until it wasn't. What frightened them most wasn't a single threat. It was the convergence of many small ones, aligning at the worst possible time. Energy markets were vulnerable. Financial instruments were growing more complex than the rules designed to govern them. Global alliances were shifting, quietly redrawing lines that had once felt fixed. And beneath it all was a growing fear that when the next shock arrived, America wouldn't be ready. Inside the rooms where decisions were shaped, the language changed. Words like risk and uncertainty gave way to control and containment. The question was no longer whether the system could fail, it was how to prevent that failure from becoming visible. That's when the idea moved from theory to proposal. It wasn't introduced dramatically, it arrived as a memo, carefully worded, deliberately dull, the kind of document designed to survive scrutiny by appearing harmless. But buried within it was a radical shift in how power would operate. A few voices pushed back immediately. They warned that the plan concentrated too much authority in too few hands, that it created mechanisms that could be expanded quietly, without oversight, that once such tools existed, future leaders would be tempted to use them for reasons far removed from the original intent. Those warnings were acknowledged and then set aside. The counterargument was always the same: extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. The plan, they argued, wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about continuity, about ensuring that when instability struck, decisions could be made quickly, decisively, without the delays of public debate. Speed became the justification, secrecy became the method. As discussions continued, safeguards were promised, limits were defined, oversight was described in reassuring terms, but those details were flexible by design, adjustable, interpretable, written in a way that future readers could expand without technically breaking any rules. That flexibility was seen as a feature,
not a flaw. One participant in the discussions raised a simple but unsettling question. What happens when people forget why this was created? The room went quiet. Because everyone understood the implication, systems outlive intentions, and once embedded, they don't disappear easily. But the fear of immediate collapse outweighed concerns about distant misuse. Eventually, the debate narrowed. The choice was framed as binary: either act now, quietly and decisively, or risk being remembered as the ones who hesitated while the system unraveled. History shows how powerful that framing can be. When the final approval came, it wasn't unanimous, it never is, but dissent was contained. Objections were noted, then neutralized by process. The machinery of governance moved forward, smooth and unstoppable. Implementation was handled with precision. Nothing was announced publicly. Instead, changes were folded into existing structures. Adjustments were made in language few people read. Authorities were expanded through technical revisions that sounded procedural rather than transformative. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual, but inside the system, something fundamental had shifted. Decisions that once required broad consensus could now be accelerated. Actions that once demanded explanation could be justified through internal review. Power no longer had to announce itself. It could operate quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability. For a while, the results seemed to validate the choice. Crises were managed swiftly. Markets stabilized faster than expected. International reactions were anticipated and countered with remarkable precision. To those inside the vault, it felt like proof that the decision had been necessary all along. Success, however, has a way of masking long-term costs. As years passed, the mechanisms created for emergencies began to normalize. What was once exceptional became routine. Processes designed for rare moments were applied more broadly, justified by convenience and efficiency rather than necessity. Oversight weakened, not through malice, but through habit. Fewer questions were asked, fewer explanations were required. The system worked, and working systems are rarely challenged. Meanwhile, the public felt the effects without understanding the cause. Policies seemed to appear fully formed, resistant to debate. Major shifts occurred with minimal explanation. Decisions felt distant, abstract, made somewhere far away by people no one had elected to make them. Trust began to erode, not suddenly, gradually. People sensed that something had changed, even if they couldn't name it, that the space between decision and consequence had grown wider, that power had become harder to see, harder to question, harder to hold accountable. And that was the paradox at the heart of the original choice. The decision was made to protect stability, but in doing so, it quietly altered the relationship between the nation and the people who lived in it. By the time critics began to connect the dots, the structure was already too embedded to dismantle easily. What had started as a response to fear had become part of the architecture of governance itself. In the next part of this story, we'll follow the consequences forward, examining how this hidden decision reshaped moments of crisis, influenced later leaders, and created a pattern that still defines American power today. Because once a nation learns how to make decisions in silence, it rarely forgets.
The true impact of the decision didn't reveal itself immediately. It waited, it watched, and when the moment was right, it emerged, not as a shock, but as a pattern. The first major test came during a national crisis, not the kind that arrives with explosions or sirens, but one that unfolds through uncertainty. Markets trembled, information conflicted, fear traveled faster than facts. The public demanded clarity, while institutions struggled to keep pace with the chaos. This time, however, something was different. Decisions came faster than anyone expected, Policies were announced with confidence, backed by data that wasn't fully disclosed. Emergency measures were enacted before debate could even begin. From the outside, it looked like strong leadership. Inside the system, it was something else entirely. The mechanisms created years earlier were activated almost instinctively. There was no need to ask whether they should be used, only how far they could go without attracting attention. What had once required justification now required only procedure. The crisis passed, damage was limited, and once again, success reinforced the belief that the original choice had been right. But success leaves footprints. With each activation, the threshold for using extraordinary powers lowered. What once required a national emergency now required only the perception of risk, and perception, as history shows, is easily shaped. Future leaders inherited this system without fully understanding the debates that had surrounded its birth. To them, it wasn't a controversial decision, it was simply how things were done, a tool set already installed, already tested, already proven effective. And tools invite use. Over time, subtle shifts began to appear in how authority functioned. Transparency became optional. Public explanations grew vague. Decisions were framed as technical necessities rather than moral choices. The language of governance changed, from values to metrics, from principles to outcomes. This shift wasn't imposed through force, it happened through convenience. Why endure lengthy debates when faster paths existed? Why risk uncertainty when control was available? The system rewarded efficiency, not deliberation. Meanwhile, those outside the decision-making circle felt increasingly disconnected. Policies affected lives in profound ways, yet the reasoning behind them remained obscured. Questions were met with reassurances, concerns were labeled misunderstandings, and skepticism was quietly reframed as disloyalty or ignorance. A dangerous dynamic took hold. When power becomes invisible, accountability weakens, and when accountability weakens, trust erodes, even if the system continues to function on the surface. Some insiders noticed the shift and grew uneasy. They recognized that the architecture designed to prevent collapse could also prevent correction, that a system optimized for stability might resist necessary change. But by then, reversing course meant dismantling structures deeply woven into governance, and dismantling stability, even flawed stability, is one of the hardest choices any leader can make. So instead, the system adapted. Checks were redefined. Oversight committees expanded in name but not authority. Reviews were conducted internally, conclusions classified. The appearance of accountability remained, even as its substance thinned. To the public, this era felt confusing. Crises seemed endless, economic, social, geopolitical. Each one justified new measures, new controls, new limitations framed as temporary. But temporary solutions have a habit of becoming permanent when no clear endpoint is defined. Gradually, a realization set in among observers and historians. This wasn't a series of isolated decisions, it was a trajectory. The original choice hadn't just solved a problem, it had reshaped how problems were solved. It created a mindset where speed outranked consent and secrecy outweighed dialogue. And perhaps most importantly, it normalized the idea that the public didn't need to know everything, only enough to remain calm. That assumption marked a turning point. Because democracy doesn't collapse all at once, it fades in increments, through small trade-offs made during moments of fear, through decisions justified as necessary, reasonable, unavoidable. Each step seems harmless on its own. Together, they redefine the relationship between power and people. By the time resistance began to organize, it faced a system uniquely prepared to absorb it.
Protests were anticipated, narratives were managed, responses were calibrated to appear proportional, even when guided by deeper strategies invisible to those affected. The system wasn't cruel, it was efficient, and efficiency without transparency can be more dangerous than outright oppression, because it rarely feels like tyranny while it's happening. Yet history has a way of resurfacing buried questions. Scholars revisiting archived documents began to notice inconsistencies. Journalists uncovered fragments of conversations that hinted at alternative paths never taken. Former officials, long retired, spoke cautiously about moments when different choices had been possible. A pattern emerged. At key crossroads, silence had been chosen over debate, and silence leaves no record of dissent. The story of this decision, then, isn't just about power, it's about absence, about the conversations that never reached the public, the options never presented, the futures quietly closed off without announcement. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of all. If a nation's direction can be altered without its people fully realizing it, then where does choice truly reside? In the next and final part, we'll confront that question directly. We'll examine the long-term consequences of the unchosen path, explore whether reversal is still possible, and ask what this story reveals about the future of American decision-making. Because some decisions don't end when they're made, they echo.
By the time the consequences became impossible to ignore, the decision had already done its work. It wasn't visible as a single law, a single leader, or a single moment of collapse. Instead, it existed as an atmosphere, a way of governing so familiar that few remembered anything different. The machinery ran smoothly, too smoothly, and that, paradoxically, was the warning sign. Nations are healthiest when friction exists, when ideas clash, when decisions take time because people argue about them. But the system born from that original choice had minimized friction by design. Debate was no longer essential, it was optional. And optional debates eventually disappear. The unchosen path, the one discussed briefly and dismissed quietly, would have demanded something harder than control. It would have required trust. Trust in institutions to withstand uncertainty. Trust in citizens to absorb uncomfortable truths. Trust that openness, even when messy, could produce resilience stronger than secrecy ever could. But trust is slow. Fear is fast. So the faster path won. As decades passed, leaders changed, parties shifted, crises evolved, but the underlying structure remained. Each new administration promised reform while quietly relying on the same mechanisms they claimed to question. Because once power is inherited, giving it back feels like voluntary weakness, and no leader wants to be the one who loosens control right before the next disaster. The result was a nation constantly bracing for impact, always preparing, always managing risk, always justifying expanded authority as temporary, even when temporary stretched into years. Citizens adapted too. People learned to live with ambiguity, to accept that explanations would be incomplete, to lower expectations of transparency in exchange for a sense, sometimes an illusion, of stability. Outrage flared, then faded. Attention moved on. That adaptation was perhaps the most profound consequence of all. Not repression, not collapse, but normalization. Because when people stop expecting to be included in decisions, power no longer needs to exclude them deliberately. Absence becomes mutual. Yet history has never been kind to systems built entirely on control. Over time, cracks formed, not in the structure, but in legitimacy. Younger generations questioned assumptions older ones had accepted. Why did decisions feel distant? Why were consequences immediate, but explanations delayed? Why did participation feel symbolic rather than meaningful?
These questions didn't come from ideology, they came from experience, and experience is difficult to dismiss. Slowly, cautiously, conversations reopened. Archives were re-examined. Classified materials were challenged. The narrative of necessity began to compete with a new narrative, one that asked whether the original fear had been overstated and whether the cost of secrecy had been underestimated. Some called it naive, others called it dangerous. But once the question existed, it couldn't be erased. Could the system be undone? The honest answer is complicated. Structures like this aren't dismantled with a single reform. They persist because they solve real problems, even as they create new ones. Reversal would require leaders willing to accept uncertainty, citizens willing to engage deeply, and institutions prepared to function in full view of public scrutiny again. That's not impossible, but it is rare. The unchosen America, the version that might have emerged from openness rather than silence, was never guaranteed to be better. It might have struggled more publicly, failed more visibly, argued more loudly, but it would have belonged more clearly to its people. Instead, the chosen path optimized for survival over participation. And survival, while essential, is not the same as vitality. This story isn't an accusation, it's a reminder. Every generation inherits systems built by the fears of the previous one. The question is whether it has the courage to re-examine them, or whether it mistakes longevity for wisdom. The original decision-makers believed they were protecting the future. In many ways, they succeeded, but they also narrowed the range of futures available. That is the quiet power of decisions made in silence. They don't announce what they take away. They simply remove options until one day people wonder why choice feels so limited. And that brings us back to the vault. Not a physical place, but a metaphor. A space where decisions are stored, insulated from public view, locked not by malice, but by habit, guarded not by force, but by precedent. Vaults can be opened, but only if people remember that they exist. The future of American decision-making won't be determined by a single election or reform. It will be shaped by whether transparency is seen as a risk or as a strength worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable. Because nations don't lose their freedom when power is taken. They lose it when power no longer needs to ask. And that is the legacy of the decision that changed everything, not through spectacle, but through silence. If this story made you pause and think, if it felt like more than just history, then subscribing isn't just a click, it's a choice. Liking this video tells the algorithm that these hidden decisions and untold stories matter, and by sharing it, you help bring these conversations out of silence and into the open. On DecisioVault, we don't just tell stories, we question the decisions that shape nations and futures. Subscribe, because some choices are too important to ignore.